As SpaceX continues preparations for Starship's next launch using an improvised ship static fire stand, so cool, the company is also making major progress building the next generation of Starship vehicles. In that vein, this week teams installed a massive fuel transfer tube in Booster 18, and we spotted loads of hardware for future ships all lined up in the Starfactory. As always, there was also a shipload of work on both pads as well as the foundation for the new Giga Bay, but also our Florida team flew over the Space Coast this week, so be ready to be teased with relevant Starship footage from that flyover as well. Hi Star People, I'm Jack Beyer for NSF, and this is your Starbase Update. Let's start off with Flight 10, because I'm sure a lot of you watching are most interested in that. As you probably know, in the last several weeks, SpaceX teams have been working at the launch site on modifying an existing ship transport stand and turning it into a static fire stand. Well, that work is continuing, and recently there have been some new additions. Remember those steel structures we saw employees build near the launch mount last week? At the time, we thought those would actually get welded below the stand to widen the stand's stance. Say that 10 times fast. And therefore, that the stand would sit on top of the launch mount and not down on the hold-down arms. But as it turns out, those steel structures are not for that purpose. Teams welded them between the top and bottom ring of the stand rather than underneath it, so now it's most likely that these structures are supports for the bracing on the ends of the RVac engine nozzles. Raptor vacuum engines have larger nozzles, which increases their efficiency in vacuum conditions. But at sea level, that means the exhaust gases can collapse under the atmospheric pressure before exiting the nozzle, creating an effect called flow separation. I hope Ryan is using shuttle footage to demonstrate this, even though there are plenty of examples of it happening on RVacs thanks to SpaceX releasing scads of glorious slow-mo. That flow separation creates lots of bending forces, and that creates a lot of unwanted stress on your engine. To prevent those bending forces from actually bending the nozzle, SpaceX installs a specialized brace around the end of the vacuum nozzle extension to keep it rigid during the firing. It's also worth noting that this isn't the only bracing on the nozzles, as there is bracing near the base of each nozzle which connects to the ship's skirt, but there you go. This applies not just to individual engines, but also when they're integrated on ships and when they're fired on the ground. In that case, the nozzle exit braces are attached to supports on the stand itself, and since they're modifying this transport stand to be a static fire stand, that's why they had to install all of this bracing and support structure on it. So, now the theory goes back to the original one, that they're just going to use the 20 hold-down arms on the launch mount to grab onto the makeshift static fire stand and do things that way. Pretty cool. Now, a lot of you, and us too frankly, were wondering how the heck they're going to fill the ship with propellant while it's on the launch mount. We had theories, lots of them, as usual, but as the saying goes, seeing is believing. This week, it seems like SpaceX has started building an adapter to help with the filling of propellant on the ship. On the backside of the BQD hood, teams have cut multiple new openings and have started to connect new pipework to the BQD pipework via these holes. On other parts of the BQD, workers have installed a series of truss sections that will be used to support this new pipework around and on top of the hood. We have also observed pipework coming out of the openings that reaches to the top of the hood, and from there it'll likely be flex hoses connected between this solid pipework and the back of the ship QD plate to allow the plate to move back and forth as needed. This freedom of movement would allow the QD plate to properly interface with the ship. Last week, we even spotted SpaceX teams moving a ship quick disconnect plate out of Mega Bay 2, so maybe that'll be used on this contraption here at the launch site. Perhaps it'll look a bit different than what we just described, but as more and more parts come together, SpaceX's plan becomes a little bit more clear. Now that we think we know the how, the question is when the static fire may happen. This week, we saw a few Raptor engines going into Mega Bay 2, and since Ship 38 has not gone through cryogenic proof testing just yet, we assume these are most likely for Ship 37. We had thought that Ship 37 might have received at least one engine back in June, right before Ship 36's explosion. At that time, that was likely as part of the preparations for a static fire test prior to Flight 11, which was supposed to be the flight using Ship 37, and we're unsure if the engine was actually installed or not because Ship 36 just blew up. After Ship 36's explosion, SpaceX probably halted the Raptor installation process until they were closer to actually testing Ship 37, which is why we never saw any more engines going into Mega Bay 2 until this week. Now that we can see engines have resumed being moved into Mega Bay 2 again, that kind of gives us a clue that perhaps Ship 37's static fire may indeed occur fairly soon. Of course, there is a chance that these might be for Ship 38, and perhaps SpaceX will skip cryo testing and go straight to a static fire test with that ship. But that's probably a little bit more than unlikely, because, Ship 37 has been preparing for a static fire test. There's also the fact that Ship 38 is on the middle workstation stand, so in theory we would see the engines enter the workstation elevator and be raised up under the ship, but that's not what happened. They went to the left side of the Mega Bay instead, which is where Ship 37 is. We'll keep that option in mind though, just in case. In other Flight 10 news, this week SpaceX also filed a communications permit with the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, in order to communicate with Starship during Flight 10. The start of operations date for this license begins on August 4th and extends for the typical 6-month period. Now, it's probably worth mentioning that this is not the first of these licenses for Flight 10, and that SpaceX already filed one on May 8th and another on May 12th, probably with the thought that the flight was going to happen soon. One neat thing, though, as explained in the document, is that SpaceX is adding an additional location to uplink through certain frequencies to the booster and ship, and so that needs a new license. By the way, quick side note, the coordinates for that new uplink location point to none other than the Margaritaville Hotel. It's also probably worth talking about that August 4th start of operations date. Normally when these FCC permits go out, that date gives you a rough inkling for when a launch may happen, but it's not a date you should take too seriously. We always see people posting these on social media like, oh my god, we have a date for flight, and it's like a range. It's not a date. Normally the actual target for launch ends up being several days, if not weeks later than the date stated on the document. For example, the Flight 10 FCC permit I said was filed on May 12th had an operations date start of June 16th, and given how things were going before Ship 36's explosion, the launch was actually closer to the end of the month. The date does, however, give us an idea of when SpaceX might be targeting, and that August is plausible, though exactly when in August is an exercise for you, the viewer. Of course, as we get close and there are more and more tea leaves to read, we'll keep you all updated, so stay tuned to our socials as always. And if you want to learn how to read the tea leaves, we did make a video about it where Das explains all of the pieces of the puzzle, so check that out. It also tells us that they don't seem to be looking at July for a launch, and that sort of tracks with the work we're seeing right now to prepare for Ship 37's static fire test. It may very well be a week or two until the pad is ready to accept Ship 37 and perform a static fire test on it. And after that, it may take another week or two to remove everything that was needed for ship testing and revert the launch mount back to launch configuration. So perhaps a launch target around mid-August could be somewhat realistic and lines up with this permit. But as always, don't book a trip just yet. This is probably the best possible scenario, like a green lights to Malibu situation.
Well, guess what? As always, there's late breaking news right before we publish Starbase Update. Just a little while ago, Elon posted on X that they're targeting launch in about 3 weeks. It's July 14th when I record this and when he posted that. If you move forward 3 weeks on the calendar, that's August 4th, the same date as on the FCC permit. Should we still fully take it to heart? Who knows? It may very well be Elon time. We'll see.
Okay, so after Flight 10, there is Flight 11, and that will be the last flight of the current version of boosters and ships. After that, we'll have Block 3, the next generation of Starship. If you've been keeping up to date and watching Starbase Update, you may have already seen that SpaceX is well underway stacking the first Block 3 booster, Booster 18. This week, teams moved a giant tube from the Starfactory to the Mega Bay for installation on Booster 18. This tube is really big, to say the least. Doing a rough size estimation, it seems like it's about 33 meters in length and about 3 meters in diameter, which means it's almost the size of a Falcon 9 first stage. Inside Super Heavy. Nearly 2 days after we saw it go into Mega Bay 1, SpaceX posted about it on X, referring to it as a fuel transfer tube. And that's interesting. Not because we didn't expect this to function as a transfer tube, but because there was no mention of the liquid oxygen header tank. I'll explain. This transfer tube is an extremely complex and critical piece of hardware, and it's much different from what's used on the current version of boosters. So with the current design being used in Block 2 boosters, the fuel transfer tube goes from the bottom of the methane tank, where there's a sump, a low point, down to the aft section, where there's a manifold, a set of pipes, that distributes the methane to the engines. Down at the bottom of the liquid oxygen tank, there's also another tank, roughly 3 meters or 9 feet in diameter, that surrounds the transfer tube and holds the liquid oxygen that's used for landing the booster. It's sort of a header tank. And right under that tank is, you guessed it, another sump that holds a small amount of methane immediately above the aft cap, which is the bottom of the aft dome. You may remember them being referred to colloquially as a thrust puck back in the day. With the current generation of Super Heavy, Block 2 or whatever you want to call it, the whole assembly starts with lowering the transfer tube down through the common dome while the booster's LOX tank is partially stacked. Then the aft section that has the LOX header tank and engine supply manifolds integrated into it rolls into Mega Bay 1, gets joined to the rest of the LOX tank, and internally the transfer tube gets welded to the top of more transfer tube sticking out of the top of the LOX header tank, thus completing assembly of that particular element of the booster. Going into Block 3, we obviously expected this to change, especially since we had seen at least 2 distinct header tank test articles, or at least that's what they appeared to be to us. One of them was tested at McGregor, while the other was constructed in the Starfactory and integrated into Booster 18.1 for testing in the structural test stand at Massey's. We thought this was probably going to be a larger version of the header tank design in Block 2 Super Heavy, because larger booster, so larger header tank, right? But the thought was that there would still be a transfer tube extending downward from the bottom of the methane tank, and then there would be this larger header tank surrounding it. But that's clearly not what's happening now. We're seeing what we've seen with this fuel transfer tube. The tweet from SpaceX mentions how this redesigned transfer tube will enable faster, more reliable flip maneuvers and the ability for simultaneous engine startup, which, by the way, sounds awesome, though I will miss the staggered start. It's absolutely beautiful. Elon also referred to it as more of a fuel header tank than a transfer tube. Taking note of this combined information, it implies that this won't only be used for landing, but also the boost back phase of flight, which would explain why it's a lot larger than we had thought previously. What is not evident is where the LOX header tank is, if there's even one there. For all we know, the LOX header tank could be a completely different and even wider cylinder surrounding the bottom of the methane transfer tube. It could also possibly sit directly under the transfer tube, allowing the methane to pass through the center of it if the transfer tube shrinks in diameter at that point. Or it could be a separate tank entirely that sits on the sidewall of the main LOX tank, just like we saw for boosters 4 and 5. Remember how jank they looked in comparison to what we see now? Another potential here is that this big tube already contains the LOX header tank, but it's just not visible. There could be a common bulkhead or dome inside that separates the methane and oxygen with a shorter, thinner transfer tube for the fuel passing through the oxygen, just like we see in the current design that's being used. It's just hard to know whether that's the case or not because there aren't any weld marks visible on the outside that would clearly show that. Well, there are in fact a lot of weld marks on this tube, so it's actually rather hard to single 1 or 2 of them out. Whatever the design is, we may get more clues once the aft section for Booster 18 rolls into the Mega Bay, which, as a reminder, it hasn't yet and we're all keeping our eyes peeled for. It's going to be really interesting to see all of this hardware in action when Block 3 first flies. Now, of course, it isn't just boosters that SpaceX is manufacturing right now. Inside of the Starfactory, there are several pieces of hardware for the first Block 3 ships, and thankfully, we can spot some of them through the Starfactory's glass windows. Through these windows, we can mostly see nose cones, but there are also other pieces of hardware visible as well. Let's start off with the first Block 3 ship, Ship 39, and then go down the production line to the newest one we've seen, Ship 44. Yeah, that's right, 44. From Highway 4, looking into the Starfactory, we can see the nose cone production line. Here, nose cones go through different steps in production by moving from one bay to another, with the furthest ships in production being all the way to the left, and the earliest in production being all the way to the right, closest to the office building and the beach. So, all the way on the left, we have Ship 39's nose cone, which in the last week has received its forward flap aero covers. This nose cone has no KO wool, ablative layer, or thermal protection system tiles installed on it, other than the handful of tiles that came pre-installed with the aero covers. It's pretty interesting to see that SpaceX has not yet installed tiles on this nose cone, as previous ships had already gotten tiles by this point in their production. Also, Ship 39's nose cone hasn't even been stacked on its payload bay yet, which is another thing that normally happens around this time in construction. It wouldn't be surprising if SpaceX is just piling up all of this hardware and concentrating on flying the remaining Block 2 ships before beginning to stack a Block 3 ship. They also probably want to have all the necessary tooling like work stands, transport stands, and other sort of handling equipment available before starting any sort of that work. To the right of Ship 39's nose cone is Ship 40's nose cone, which doesn't seem to present many changes from when we checked in on it last week. It still has its tile pins and everything, but other than that, no major changes. Going further to the right, there are nose cones for Ship 41 and Ship 42. Ship 41 seems to have already received its methane header tank, as it does present the weld marks from that, whereas Ship 42 seems to still be awaiting that welding. Through some of the other windows of the Starfactory, I also spotted several barrel sections, one of them with a label indicating it was the common dome barrel for Ship 42. To the right of Ship 42's nose cone is Ship 43's liquid oxygen header tank. How do we know that? Well, apart from the fact that it is a LOX header tank and Ship 42 already has that header tank installed, I took this picture showing a label on it. Label shots feel increasingly rare these days, so to get 2 label shots in one night was a real treat. The label here clearly says it's for Ship 43 and shows that it is the LOX header tank, which is denoted with a quote LOX-forward quote on the label. To the right of Ship 43's LOX header tank, we can see 2 nose cone tips poking up into view, one with workers around it to the far right and another without them to the left. These are nose cones still very early in construction, and so because of that, they're smaller, like baby nose cones, and thus closer to the floor, which is why we can barely see them. They'll later be raised and stacked and then installed on dedicated workstations where all the various bits of hardware that we just talked about, and a bunch more, is installed. It's very likely that the nose cone without workers around it is Ship 43's nose cone tip awaiting stacking on its base, which is likely in front of it but out of view, followed by sleeving over the LOX header tank for it to the left. The other nose cone being worked on by employees could therefore be Ship 44's nose cone. In another section of the Starfactory, I also spotted another header tank down on the floor, which could be a LOX header tank for Ship 44, since that would be the one next in line, and it's being built right next to 44's nose cone tip. Alternatively though, it could be a methane header tank for Ship 43, but it's hard to tell. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of other hardware sitting around just waiting to be put together inside the Starfactory. And I need to remind you that everything we just talked about was only what was visible in one part of one lane of the factory through windows that just happened to face Highway 4. I would love to be a fly on the wall inside a Starfactory to think of all the other pieces of hardware they're working on in there. There must be some really dazzling things. As we've been talking about the next generation of Starship, all future Block 3 ships and boosters will be flying with Raptor 3 engines. And you know where you can find and see Raptor 3 engines? That's right, not at Starbase, but you can at McGregor. That's right, it's time for our McGregor Minute. Or minutes. It's usually minutes, let's be honest. This week at SpaceX's McGregor engine testing facility, we saw 13 tests of Raptor engines, 9 of them from the vertical stand and 4 of them from the newer southern stand. Of those 4, 2 were actually a relight test featuring a short 20-second burn followed by a 6-second burn shortly after shutdown. 4 out of those 9 tests from the vertical stand were also at or around 180 seconds, which could indicate that those were engines being tested for flight, as the other tests were shorter. Now, one interesting thing that we spotted at McGregor this week has been a green Raptor 3. Ever since it was first unveiled last year, we've always seen pictures and renders of Raptor 3 with a black nozzle and black power head, even the RVAC. Sometimes Raptor and Merlin engines pass by our cameras at McGregor. The Raptor 2s are usually green, and the Raptor 3s just look black. However, in a couple of instances, we've seen what appeared to be a Raptor 3 engine in a green color. We know it's a Raptor 3 engine because of certain unique features, like the hot gas manifold having its own boxy enclosure, plus the fact that it just looks a lot more bare. Seeing a green Raptor 3 is really rare though, and what's more, this one only seemed to have a 3 painted on the nozzle, which is super confusing, as that would mean it's rather early in the production run, and we've already seen Raptor 3s in their 30s. Of course, it could be that it's a 2-digit number, but one strap holding the Raptor is just blocking the first digit. Either way, it's super interesting to see that perhaps the black color of Raptor 3 may not be completely specific to the engine, and they might still be green like Raptor 2. It could also just be a coating that comes off over time after the engines have been tested repeatedly, but we'll keep watching and see what we can learn. Coming back to Starbase, SpaceX continues to clean up the Massey test site following Ship 36's explosion. This week, the work seems to be centered around the methane tank farm located at the south end of the complex. This part of the test site is where the most damage was suffered due to being rather close to the explosion, but also because there was still methane flowing through various GSE, ground support equipment, on site. Earlier in the week, SpaceX took down all the very badly burned vaporizers that were present in the methane tank farm. Teams have also erected a new crane on site near the methane tank farm and have already removed a nitrogen tank that was being used for methane subcooling. It's very likely that we'll continue to see the rest of the methane tank farm hardware removed and then possibly see that tank farm shifted further away from the ship's static fire stand, and be maybe even redesigned to better withstand explosive events like that in the future, should something like a Ship 36 explosion ever occur again. Apart from that work, teams continue the repairs of the ship's static fire stand, which has been surrounded with even more scaffolding as part of that work. The sound of pneumatic hammers is also audible constantly when you're nearby, as crews tear up burned concrete, and accordingly, dump trucks with loads of rubble and debris are transporting them seemingly non-stop. There are even so many workers on site at the Massey Outpost right now that there is now overflow parking on Massey Way itself, so clearly SpaceX is putting in the effort.
Side note, the 2 tanks that SpaceX removed this weekend from the Massey Outpost were seen on McGregor Live. Not sure why they moved them there, but you can see why it's important to keep an eye on McGregor. You never know when hardware will be going to or from Starbase to there.
Coming back to the launch site, work continues on the orbital launch mount. Workers work every day around the clock on the second launch mount, continuing to outfit it with all the hardware needed for it to work properly. The scale of the work needed here to complete the launch mount and its service structure is just mind-blowing. It's a hive of activity every time we look over there. The workers look like tiny ants next to everything. It's mind-boggling. And when this thing is done, oh, it's gonna be sweet. Of course, the second pad at Starbase consists not only of the launch mount and flame trench, but also the launch tower too. And this week, teams have added even more cladding to Tower 2. It's not clear how much of this tower will be covered with cladding, but it's definitely already received way more than Tower 1. The chopsticks were also lowered this week after spending some time sitting up higher on the tower. They likely spent time at that height to allow for enough space for the remaining launch mount arms to be installed, and also would have left enough space needed for cladding installation. Apart from that hands-on work, we've also got more testing of the tank farm for the second pad. This test seemed to be, once again, all about the subcoolers at the tank farm, as we saw them start to get frosty and then vent through the fan exhaust system situated behind them. You know what I say, more data, more better. So the more they test this hardware at this point in time, the more they can have it in tune for actual launches. Now, through all those subcoolers and pumps, there will be literally thousands of tons of propellant flowing for every launch. That propellant needs to come from somewhere, and right now, literally all of it is trucked into the launch site via tankers. But that's going to change in the near future. Just this week, SpaceX received approval from Cameron County to build an air separation unit in front of the launch site on the north side of Highway 4. An air separation unit, it separates air. It takes in air and it distills it to separate it into liquid nitrogen, liquid oxygen, and argon. And as you may know, SpaceX needs lots of liquid oxygen as an oxidizer on Starship in order to burn its methane fuel. It also needs lots of liquid nitrogen for subcooling of both oxygen and methane at the tank farm, among many other uses. And the argon can also be used for welding, something SpaceX does a little bit of in the Starship program. Now, according to reports, it seems like some of the oxygen and nitrogen may still need to be trucked in, but this plant will greatly reduce the amount of trucks going to the launch site, which in turn greatly reduces the amount of traffic going along Highway 4. And of course, all the methane will need to remain being trucked into the launch site, at least for the time being. Also note, this is different than the announcement a few weeks back about an air separation unit being built in Brownsville proper, which is interesting because that facility was also supposed to supply Starbase, but who knows, maybe they just need both. In more infrastructure updates at Starbase, this week SpaceX started installing the piles needed for the foundation of the Giga Bay. The piles are installed using something called continuous flight augering, often known by its acronym as CFA. This method of installing piles makes use of a CFA drilling rig, which essentially drills a long hole deep down into the ground. Concrete is then pumped into the hole as the auger is pulled out, then a rebar cage is lowered down into the concrete while it's still fresh. The concrete is then left to cure and harden, creating a pile. We expect hundreds of these piles to be installed in the ground for the Giga Bay foundations, since the building is going to have such a massive footprint. That many piles will give a strong enough foundation upon which the facility can rise, but if we use the progress of the Giga Bay construction work over at Roberts Road in Florida as an example, it'll still be many months until we start to see Starbase Giga Bay rise up out of the ground. Speaking of the Roberts Road Giga Bay construction, like I said at the start of the show, our Florida team flew over the Space Coast this week and they were able to observe the massive amount of progress on the construction of that bay. And they could see that SpaceX is still pretty darn busy working on its foundation. Also, they spotted a lot more progress at LC-39A, where work on the Starship flame trench continues. And this week, our Space Coast Live cameras spotted several sections of steel flame trench wall going toward LC-39A. Also, work is underway on a large foundation to the north for Starship's tank farm. As we had already reported in May, SpaceX is currently working on getting a new Starship tower built. During the flyover, our Florida team spotted the first tower columns being staged at the site. It's currently unclear exactly which site on the Space Coast where this tower will go, but you can bet we'll make sure to keep you updated as soon as we find out more information. Additionally, the launch mount for the LC-39A Starship launch pad has also seen a load more progress over the last few months, with most of the water-cooled pancake deck now placed on top. Stay tuned for a full, in-depth Space Coast flyover episode releasing this week, containing a lot more updates, not just about Starship, but about all the other companies present on the Space Coast. Alright, that's it for this super info-dense episode of Starbase Update. It takes an entire team of people to get these shows and everything we do here at NSF done, and your continued support means the world to us. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget, be excellent to each other.